Hey everyone, the first thing that I want to say right off the bat is don't be intimidated by the length of this video. I've used chapter settings extensively throughout the video, so you can just skip to the chapters that you're interested in. And the ending of the video is going to be mostly statistical analysis and references. So if you want to just get through the meat of the video, you can ignore a lot of the end of the video. So don't tune off just because you see that the video is pretty long. All right, in this video, I'm going to talk about what I think is one of the most fascinating and intriguing events in the New Testament that is also, I think, one of the most widely attested events in the New Testament, and that is the tearing of the veil. Now, this video is going to be mostly intended towards atheists who are listeners, and the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because this is maybe the first event that really made me question my atheism. In other words, when I dove into some of the research behind the tearing of the veil, that was the first time that I really felt like I was struggling and doing some intellectual backflips to justify my atheism in the face of something that is attested by multiple sources. Now, we are not going to rely heavily on the New Testament for what we talk about in this video. When we talk in this video about the tearing of the veil, most of what we're going to be talking about is evidence from other sources that are outside of the New Testament. And the reason why is because I first encountered this phraseology about the tearing of the veil as an atheist, and the first thing I did was I looked it up in other sources and I looked for antagonistic sources that verify whether or not this happened. So we're going to retrace those steps in this video. In other words, I'm going to be basically recapitulating some of the research that I did essentially as an atheist when I first encountered this very interesting topic. All right, now I'm going to make a bold claim at the beginning of the video. The first claim is going to be that I think if you watch this video in its entirety, I think there is enough evidence in this video that if you're reasonable and neutral, I believe sincerely that it will move the needle for you at least a little bit, which is what it did for me. So I know that's a bold claim, and I would love to know if that claim actually pays off. In other words, does this video change what you think about the veracity of the New Testament or the significance of Jesus to history or maybe even to theological history? That's my question to all of you, and I hope you weigh in on that question thoughtfully at the end of the video. Now, the other thing that I can predict about this video, and I hope this prediction is certainly true, is that I think you will find this journey really fascinating. I was really enthralled, engrossed, and fascinated throughout all the research that I was doing on the topics that we're going to discuss in this video, and I hope you all are fascinated by these details as well. We are a new channel, so your comments really help us out. If you click the like button on this video, that's massively helpful to us, especially because we're such a new channel. It helps us much more than even some of the bigger channels. So if you click subscribe, that's super wonderful, and we really, really appreciate that, again, especially as a new channel. If you click the bell icon, that'll make sure that you get notified about future videos. And again, the most important thing to me personally is actually just to hear from you in the comment section. The other question that I'd like to pose to all of you before we get started with the topic of this video is, what are the topics that you'd like to see me talk about in the future? I'd really love to know that. Please let me know in the comment section what other topics you think I should address. All right, so quick outline for this video before we dive into it. The first section of the video is going to be highlighting different pieces of evidence that the tearing of the veil did actually occur. And then in the second part of the video, we're going to talk about something a little bit different, but as you'll see, it's very intimately tied to the tearing of the veil, which is the last 40 years of the Second Great Temple. And then at the end of the video, I'm mostly going to be talking about some statistical analysis, and I will put a lot of references in the description of this video just so that you all can look up the things that I'm saying. Now, before we get super deep into the analysis, I do want to just give you some perspective on my research on this topic. So specifically, my background was I encountered this phraseology about the tearing of the veil while I was actually an atheist. So I had a very antagonistic perspective towards the New Testament. And when I encountered this statement, I was like, wait a second, what do the Jews have to say about this? And, I asked this question to a lot of Christians, and I was really surprised that people didn't seem to have looked into that at all. So a lot of this is somewhat original research, but I will give a lot of citations and references at the end. But for me, reading about the tearing of the veil and reading about the literature around this moment in history was maybe one of the first things that really kind of shook my foundations of my atheism, that I still didn't feel like I would give up on my atheism at that point, but I did feel like, on the other hand, that I had to do a little bit of intellectual backflipping to deny the information that I was finding. Now, all right, let's start the first section by talking about what is the evidence that the tearing of the veil is an event that actually happened. Well, we can talk about the New Testament evidence pretty quickly, and the reason why is because we all know this is in the New Testament, so I'll kind of gloss over this, but all three synoptic Gospels mention that the tearing of the veil is something that happened. Now, we're going to dismiss this pretty quickly because I just kind of want to get on to the other stuff. And the reason why is I think most of, especially my atheist viewers, are going to be more interested in what the antagonistic sources about Jesus said. I still think this is going to be an interesting discussion for Christian viewers who have already made up their mind, because I think a lot of Christians aren't aware that there is a body of literature written that's antagonistic about Jesus, but still verifies some information that's in the New Testament. Now, the first big piece of ancient Jewish literature that verifies that the tearing of the veil actually happened is the Toledot Yeshu. So let's first look at the quotes in the Toledot Yeshu. Now, the tearing of the veil is mentioned in multiple different versions of the Toledot Yeshu, which I think gives this some grounding, at least as a historical claim. Now, a lot of people don't know a lot about this book. I have made a separate video about the Toledot Yeshu. I'll put a link up to point you towards that video as well. But let's first look at some of the statements in the Toledot Yeshu. So the first statement is from the Aramaic version of the Toledot Yeshu, and it's important to note that the Toledot Yeshu is a single source and probably based on a single earlier oral tradition, but was later written as several documents in several different languages. So this is an Aramaic version of the Toledot Yeshu, which says, "At the hour that they hanged him being Jesus, on the tree, the curtain of the sanctuary was torn and fell." This is from the Aramaic version. There's also a Huldreich version of the Toledot Yeshu, which says, "And on the day they hanged him, the veil of the temple was rent in twain, and darkness covered the land." There's also an Italian version of the Toledot Yeshu, which gives sort of a similar description, which says, "And as they brought him out to hang him, a great trembling took place in the temple, and the curtain was torn." So here are three versions of the Toledot Yeshu that suggest that there was indeed a tearing of the veil. Now, you should know some details about the Toledot Yeshu. Again, this was a Jewish disputation of Jesus. So even though this does verify this historical event as having happened in history, as a real thing, according to the Toledot Yeshu at least, it is not interpreted as a sign of Jesus' divinity. In other words, the writers of the Toledot Yeshu go on to state that the tearing of the veil happened because God was so angry because Jesus had blasphemed so severely. So again, you shouldn't interpret anything I'm saying as an endorsement of the religious significance ascribed to the tearing of the veil that the New Testament ascribes to that event. I hope that makes sense. This is not something that is meant to corroborate the New Testament. The Toledot Yeshu is written very much antagonistically towards Jesus. Now, can we trust this source? Many historians sort of ignore the Toledot Yeshu, and the reason why is because it has been historically used as a tool for anti-Semitism. So right off the bat, I want to say that that's abhorrent. I don't approve of that, and none of this commentary is meant to imply anything pejorative about any ethnic group. So that's one thing I want to say right off the bat. Now, what about the dating of the Toledot Yeshu? Many people have argued that we only have medieval copies of the Toledot Yeshu, so therefore we can't trust it. Now, this is a bit of a misunderstanding of the actual text itself for a few reasons. The first and most critical reason is we mostly have medieval copies of the Toledot Yeshu. They're not all medieval, but you can actually do sort of a cladistic or stomatological analysis on a body of literature. So it's just like doing sort of genetic cladistic studies. In other words, when we look at clades in a genetic tree, what we're figuring out is how far apart species may have diverged from each other. And the reason why we can figure this out is we sort of know the rate of genetic drift, and therefore if we look at how far apart two different genomes are, then we can sort of calculate how far apart in time those two species are. I hope that makes sense. I don't want to dwell on this too much because it is a little bit scientific. But the point is we can actually do the same thing with language. So if we take a minimal synthetic approach of the Toledot Yeshu, we can sort of trace it back to see what the versions have in common to do sort of a minimal synthetic approach by accumulating the elements of each version of the Toledot Yeshu that each book has in common. In other words, we can sort of do a cladistic or stomatological analysis on this text itself. Now, lots of people have written about this and have concluded that the Toledot Yeshu is at least based on something from at least the 2nd or 3rd century, and probably based on an oral tradition that may be even earlier than that. I'll just give you a few different quotes because this is a point I think worth discussing. Peter Schaeffer in 2007, Jesus in the Talmud says, the Toledot Yeshu as a literary work is relatively late, but many of its motifs, such as Yeshu's illegitimacy, his magical powers, and his execution, go back to late antiquity and are embedded in earlier rabbinic texts. Schoenfield, in 1939, according to the Hebrews, writes, there can be little doubt that the oral sources behind the Toledot Yeshu go back to at least the 2nd century. So that's Hugh Schoenfield. Joseph Klausner writes in Jesus of Nazareth the nucleus of the Toledot Yeshu must go back to the 3rd century at least. So in other words, even though we only have medieval copies of the Toledot Yeshu, we know that the oral tradition does go back further than that. Now, there have been other criticisms of the Toledot Yeshu that have been levied. One is that it's satirical. Now, I don't think that this is as likely. The tone of the Toledot Yeshu, as far as I read it, is not a satirical work. Moreover, satire is not common in early Jewish writing from antiquity, especially from rabbinic culture. Daniel Boyarin in Borderlines, The Partition of Judeo-Christianity, writes, "Rabbinic culture tends to employ midrashic and dialectical methods, not the tool of satire or parody." So it would be you'd be surprised to find satire in any Jewish literature from that era. Now, another criticism that's levied is that the Toledot Yeshu is written in a way that's reactionary towards early Christianity. So they're trying to dispute the claims of early Christianity rather than disputing Jesus directly. Now, this is also an argument that doesn't hold much water, and the reason is because the Toledot Yeshu does mention other early Christians. It mentions Saul as Paul of Tarsus specifically, and it uses very exculpatory language when it talks about Paul. So from this, I think the point is made that they're going after Jesus directly, and they're laying the problems of Jesus' blasphemy at Jesus' own feet. Now, it's also important to note that the Toledot Yeshu didn't have to validate the tearing of the veil in any way. So it is interesting, and other historical authors have commented on the fact that it forms a bit of conundrum that the Toledot Yeshu does mention the tearing of the veil if that tearing of the veil didn't happen. In other words, the only people who would be able to see that veil should have been relatively high up priests in the Second Great Temple. It was not a structure that was visible to the public. So the Toledot Yeshu could have just overlooked that detail entirely, and people would have been none the wiser. So I think when we do find verification for a detail like that wouldn't have been common knowledge, that comes from a Jewish source, I think we have to take that seriously. Now, there is additional writing on the tearing of the veil, which comes from something that Josephus wrote when in the Jewish War. This is from 5.219 to 5.221. From, again, Josephus, the Jewish War. Now, I'm not going to read off this whole quote, but I will put Josephus's relevant quote on the screen. But the point of this quote is that very specifically, Josephus is describing a design element of the inner temple. What is this design element? He's describing golden doors that are along the veil. This veil, which was the veil that separated the holiest central compartment of the Second Great Temple, was therefore lined by doors in the time that Josephus saw it. Now, we know that Josephus saw these doors in around 50 or 60 AD. We also know that there is a Jewish rabbinic oral teaching that the only separation of the central compartment of the Holy of Holies, the holiest central portion of the Second Great Temple, we know that that portion was supposed to be, by oral tradition, only separated from the rest of the temple by a single veil. So we know that at some point between essentially 0 AD and 50 to 60 AD, that additional golden doors were added to the veil. Now, we have to ask ourselves, could this have been an aesthetic choice? In other words, would there have been any other reason to add doors onto the veil other than the fact that the veil somehow failed or was somehow injured or something happened to that veil? And the answer is no, this could not have been a purely aesthetic choice. Every detail, every single infinitesimal detail of the Second Great Temple was determined by holy oral tradition that was tremendously respected and revered. In other words, adding doors to the veil would not have been something that they would have done as an arbitrary decision without significant justification. So I think Josephus here, and we're going to come back to Josephus later, but I think here in this statement, Josephus is telling us something very important about the way the design of the central compartment of the Second Great Temple changed around, at least at some point before 50 or 60 AD, and that change was to add doors onto the veil. This would not have been something in accordance with ancient and more early oral tradition, and several scholars have noted this discrepancy in their analysis of Josephus' statement. So hopefully that's clear enough. So Josephus is adding here in this statement very important ancillary evidence. Now, we're going to switch gears just a little bit at this point. Now, what we're going to talk about instead, we've been talking about the tearing of the veil, but now we're going to talk about spontaneous opening of the golden doors that were likely in front of the veil. Now, we have a lot of sources that actually verify this spontaneous opening of the doors, and I'm going to go through some of them. And the reason why I think they're important is because if the veil was torn, and then that veil was replaced by doors, and then those doors seem to open up spontaneously, we would interpret that as, I think, justifiably as somewhat supportive evidence. Maybe this doesn't prove that the veil was torn, but this proves that the veil needed to be somehow augmented with doors. And I think it also proves another important point, that if we are assuming that the veil tore, and we are guessing with some pretty good evidence that the veil was augmented with doors, then we would interpret the spontaneous opening of those doors to be a sign that sort of lends credence to the tearing of the veil. I hope that makes sense. Here are some reasons why. So here are some writings about the way the doors that were somewhere in front of the veil opened up. So the first one is from Josephus again, and this is from the Jewish War. This is 6.293 to 6.296 in the Jewish War. So here, Josephus, I'll put the entire quote from Josephus on the screen. But here what Josephus is saying is that there was a wall which was engaged in front to protect the Holy of Holies. And this wall was really massive. It took 20 men to close or open this wall. This was essentially like a very thick gate. And what happened was this wall seemed to open of its own accord in the middle of the night. So that's what Josephus is saying in this first paragraph. In the second paragraph, Josephus is talking about the alarm of the guards. In other words, the guards ran and they reported the issue to the captain. So these were guards who were apparently watching the Holy of Holies at night. And they warned their captain that this omen had happened where the doors, which needed 20 people to close these doors, opened spontaneously. Now, this was interpreted by all parties at the time as something that was a very worrisome sign. Now, Josephus was generally not thought to be on the side of Jesus. That's kind of a bit of a more complicated topic that I won't delve too heavily into. But what Josephus is verifying in this quote was that we know that the barriers around the Holy of Holies, around that central holy compartment, were failing. We had to add doors to those barriers. We know now from this quote from Josephus that there had to be an additional massive gate that was added. It's not clear that this is right in front of the veil still. This may have been a different set of doors, but we know that these doors also failed. And these were doors that it took 20 men to open or close these doors. So to me, this is massively corroborating evidence. All right, now we also find evidence for this in both the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud. So I'm going to quote Yoma 39b from the Babylonian Talmud, and I'll also put the relevant quotation from the Jerusalem Talmud on the screen. But the Babylonian Talmud in Yoma 39b states, during the last 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the doors of the Hekal opened by themselves until Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai rebuked them, saying, Hekal, Hekal, why do you terrify yourself? I know that you will be destroyed. Now, this rabbi goes on to quote from the prophet Zechariah in the statement. It's probably not super relevant to this discussion, but the point here is that there were doors, they were failing, and they were opening spontaneously, and this was interpreted as an ominous or frightening sign. Now, there's an important point here that I think does weaken my analysis, and that is that these doors do not seem to be the same doors as the veil. In other words, some scholars don't differentiate between these doors and the doors that were in front of the veil, but other scholars do seem to point out that this was a different set of doors around the inner court of the temple. So this would have likely been some sort of intermediate compartment. Now, I think this is still a very worrisome sign, and this is something that was certainly interpreted very ominously. And I think, given the context of everything that we've discussed in the video up until this point, that this lends some credence to the fact that the barriers around the Holy of Holies in the Second Great Temple were being breached. So I hope that's pretty clear. We are going to turn our attention to a slightly different part of the analysis now, which is now we're going to change a little bit and talk about the last 40 years of the Second Great Temple. Now, why am I doing this in a video that's about the veil itself? Well, there's a very specific reason, because all these writings seem to bleed together a little bit, and the writings that I'm about to mention, as you'll see, describe that the ritual around the cleansing and purification of the Holy of Holies was beginning to fail. I think this not only lends credence to the tearing of the veil as part of the narrative of what's happening, it also lends credence to the theological and divine significance of the death of Jesus at this very moment. So let's look at some supporting commentary that discusses the changes that happened in the Second Great Temple during this last 40-year period. And I know this is a bit of a change of direction, but I hope after we go through this section that you'll find that it does have some relevance. All right, so during the last 40 years, there were several ominous signs that developed in the Second Great Temple. So we've talked about one of them already, which is the fact that the doors of the temple seemed to open spontaneously. But we know that the opening of doors was something that was fought against, right? They installed doors that took 20 people to open. We know also that installing additional doors would not have been something that they would have taken lightly. In other words, again, we know that oral tradition was very scrupulous about the specific construction parameters and design of the second great temple. And we know from a lot of these writings that the Jews of the time interpreted these signs as being all very ominous. Now, there were other signs that were associated with this. Now, what is the point of all this? The point of all this is the following. So the whole purpose of the second great temple, the second great temple, was realized on the Yom Kippur atonement ritual. So once a year on Yom Kippur, the highest priest of again, you'll apologize for my mispronunciations. This is not my area of expertise. But once a year, the highest priest would go into the Holy of Holies and conduct a ritual to atone for all of the sins of the Israelites. Now, there were several miraculous signs that occurred with this, ritualistic atonement. And those miracles all stopped happening all at once and all immediately at the time of Jesus' death and for the entire duration of the last 40 years of the second great temple. So, in other words, there were a lot of different miracles. One of these miracles, and some of these are a little complex, and some of these are written in some phraseology that's a little bit esoteric, but one of these miracles was that there was a light in the second great temple that was supposed to stay lit for longer than expected. This was thought to be a sign of God's enduring presence in the second great temple, and that miracle stopped happening. So now that's the first sign. The second sign is there was this essentially some fabric that was draped over the animal sacrifice that the holy priest took into this Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur when the sacrifice was performed. This cloth was red, and then when the rabbi would sacrifice and then burn the animal, that red cloth turned to white. Now, you may have heard the phrase because it pops up in a lot of theology, though your sins be crimson, they'll be white as snow. So this is a metaphor for the forgiveness of the Jewish people. So the problem was, in the last 40 years of the second great temple, that miracle of the cloth turning white from being red stopped happening. Now, there's another thing that's a little bit more esoteric, which probably I don't need to go into a whole lot of detail on, but this is the lot of the Lord would show up in the right hand of the priest. So in other words, the priest would draw lots, essentially, and the lot of the Lord would show up in the priest's right hand. And this was thought to be a harbinger that the atonement ritual had worked as it was expected to do. Now, there is a fourth sign. But this fourth sign, which was also an ominous portend, is something that we've already talked about, which is the spontaneous opening of doors. So we've already talked about that at length, so I'm not going to go through that now. But I'll refer you to the Babylonian Talmud, Yoma 39b, and I'll put a quote on the screen that goes through what all these signs are, right? And this also reiterates that these signs all stopped happening all at once, and they all stopped happening also at the same time that the doors started opening spontaneously, and also after the death of Jesus. All these atonement ritual miracles, all these miracles stopped happening all at once, all at the same time, and they were all accompanied by this spontaneous opening of doors. All this was thought to be very ominous and very horrific to the Jews. Now, I want to bring this back to our debate between atheism and religion. Now, as I said, when I was reading all this information, I was reading this from an atheistic perspective. Okay, so it was clear to me that there were two camps in first century Judea. One interpreted all these omens as a sign that Jesus was, the Messiah, that Jesus was the Savior, that the atonement ritual had stopped working because Jesus had become the sacrifice and had opened up the atonement ritual from just being for the Israelites on Yom Kippur to being anyone who wanted to ask for forgiveness anytime. This is how the Christians at the time interpreted this cessation of rituals. And they also interpreted God's presence leaving the second great temple as a good thing, because that meant that the Spirit of God could, now absolve the sins of all people of all nations for all time. Now, on the other hand, the Jews were ascribing this to a very bad series of, the Jews were obviously interpreting all these signs in a way that was very ominous, right? The Jews were saying, this is because Israel is sliding in the wrong direction and we all need to repent, and the problem is Jesus and the Christians. So interestingly, these are two sides of this argument, seeing the same set of signs and concluding something completely differently. So here I am in the middle as an atheist, and here's why this really grated against my atheism. I would have expected, as an atheist, for the death of Jesus to come and go with no significance whatsoever. In other words, the life of Jews should have gone on the day after Jesus' death in the same way as it always was. I would not have expected all of these weird events to spook out the Jews and to encourage the Christians, but I would not have expected them at all, right? As an atheist, I would have expected the death of Jesus to be of no significance whatsoever. So I'm telling you, as an atheist, this started to shake my faith. This is not evidence that I think is 100% certain. It's not a smoking gun. But I think some of this stuff, if you take it in a constellation of findings about what's going on in first century Judea, I think it makes the case that your needle has to move at least a little bit. I think there's enough evidence here that we can conclude that there was something special or weird about Jesus' life and death, that it was so impactful to so many people around him, including Jews and these sort of early Christian sects who were splitting off from the Jews at the time. All right, now we've talked about my feelings about this, but now let's translate this into some statistical analysis, okay? Because I think that's maybe going to be more helpful for a lot of people. Now, I first just want to warn you that this is going to get a little bit nerdy, so if you stop watching the video at this point, that's totally fine, okay? Now, we're going to do Bayesian analysis first because this is very in vogue among historical academicians, and it's something that a lot of people have used in the past. Now, I want to qualify this by saying that I use Bayesian analysis in my field all the time, and I think it's deeply flawed to use it in any of the contexts surrounding the issues around Jesus. And the reason why is because Bayesian analysis is really meant to mostly be used in settings where we know quantitatively what the pretest probability is. So if you have what's the chance that this person is having a heart attack? You can look at their laboratory evidence and you can calculate, do some Bayesian analysis calculation. You can say, okay, I know the pretest probability and therefore I can calculate the post-test probability given the evidence that I have in front of me. Now, the problem with using this for Jesus is just we don't really know the pretest probability. In other words, what is the prevalence of Jesus? Well, it kind of depends on what you're talking about there. So it becomes sort of a bit of a meaningless phrase. We don't know the mathematical pretest probability of Jesus existing, essentially, is what I'm saying. So that's why Bayesian analysis is, I think, limited, but it's still an interesting intellectual exercise. This is the equation that we're using for Bayes' theorem. So this is the formula that we're using in this context. So H is the hypothesis that Jesus is divine. This term is not H. This is the hypothesis that Jesus is not divine. E is the evidence, which we've discussed in the video. PH is the probability of Jesus being divine. So we're going to use 1% for this value. Now, the reason why I'm using a low number like 1% is this is in the range of what skeptical literature uses for, so I'm starting off with a very conservative estimate, if that makes sense. So again, 1% is considered sort of a skeptical range of our pretest probability being true. This term is P of E given H. So what is the probability of the evidence given H, which is the hypothesis that Jesus is divine? So this is the probability of observing the evidence that we've seen if Jesus is divine. And this term is P E not H, which is, so the probability of E given not H, or given Jesus not being divine. So what is the probability of evidence if Jesus is not divine? And then PH given E is the updated probability that Jesus is divine after considering the evidence. So in this analysis, we're estimating that the probability of E given H is approximately 90%. Now, this number might seem high, but it is justified. Is if Jesus truly was divine and his death had cosmic significance, we would expect some visible or a symbolic disruption of the temple, or we would expect some change for the Jews. We might expect the tearing of the veil. We might expect other metaphorical things to happen, and that's what we see. So 90% is justified in this context. Now, when we run this equation, what do we get? The value that we get is 8.3%. Now, if you're Christian, you might say, well, 8.3% is still pretty low. But to me, as an atheist, this is a really stunning conclusion. And the reason why is, I think if you walk up to somebody on the street and you say, hey, listen, there's a 10% chance, and I can prove it to you, there's a 10% chance that Jesus is divine, how would you act on that? Most people would say, you know what, 10%, that's enough for me. I don't need to be convinced that of a threshold that's, 99%. If you're saying that Jesus is 10% likely to be divine, then that is at least enough for me that I would want to get to know more information. So I'm not saying that you would automatically submit to Jesus, you wouldn't automatically sign up to be a Christian, but I think it would be evidence that would encourage you to learn more. I hope that makes sense. If you're, as an atheist, I really thought that, these calculations would result in a lower probability. As I've said, I'm not really an atheist anymore. I'm now what I call a reluctant believer. But my point is, that the fact that these modifiers are so high was disturbing to me as an atheist. In other words, what we're showing here is that there's an 8-fold increase in the post-test probability that Jesus is divine. And that's the bottom line. And I know I used some nerdy words of getting to that point, but that's essentially the bottom line. So briefly, let's touch upon likelihood ratio calculation. And I'll just put the equation on the screen. And I'll say using the same assumptions and the same numbers, we get a likelihood ratio of 9. So now this is similar to what we got out of Bayesian analysis. So what we're saying here is that if we have all the evidence that we have, and we're looking at the pretest probability, we don't know what that pretest probability is, we would expect the conclusions about the Toledot Yeshu, about the Talmud, about all the Jewish antagonistic literature to increase our likelihood ratio that Jesus is divine. That's all we're saying here. I think a 9-fold multiplier is very significant. So if you're entering the discussion with a conclusion that Jesus is 0% likely to be divine, then you multiply 9 times 0 and you're still at 0. But I think if you're at a very small percent, like 1%, then I think this should move the needle for you at least just a little bit. Now, there are some other means of statistical analysis. There's abductive reasoning, which just says you should infer the best explanation. I think for all the reasons that I've said already in the video, and I don't want to make this video too much longer, this is a persuasive thing to use in this tool. And again, using this tool suggests that we have at least some conclusion to move the needle towards Jesus being divine. There's narrative counterfactual reasoning. That's another type of reasoning. And I think maybe the most appropriate is inference stacking or cumulative case reasoning. Now, this suggests that rather than focusing on a single event, you weigh sort of the cumulative improbability of multiple events being coincidences under a skeptical hypothesis. So in other words, let's say we say the veil being torn at Jesus' death, the probability of that is 1 in 10. Let's say the temple omen is those things occurring around the year 30 is about 1 in 10. The hostile Jewish memory, preserving the motif of the veil being torn, that's maybe 1 in 5. Josephus' description of spontaneous door opening in a way that sort of aligns with all the other evidence, that's about 1 in 10. So if all of these variables are independent and still occur, their joint improbability under the skeptical hypothesis is essentially works out, if you do all these calculations, to 0.02%. So this means that if Jesus is not divine, the odds of seeing all these signs lining up is extremely low. Now, I think that makes a somewhat convincing case. All right, I'm so sorry that this video is so long. I really do try to keep my videos relatively short. Again, I hope you watched to this point, but if you at least skipped out on all the statistical stuff that I said at the end of the video, I totally understand that. If you want me to get more nerdy and if you want to see that stuff, let me know in the comment section. I know this has been a long video, but I'm super, super grateful for your support. By the way, I really care about a lot of you who have weighed in on the comment section. Some of you have been so warm, so supportive, so insightful, even those of you who disagree with me. So I really hope that we keep the conversation going. I hope you find this information to be interesting. For me, this was a really, really fascinating journey to get into. I just didn't know any of this stuff about the first century Judea. And so this was a really, really wonderful journey for me to embark on. I'm glad to be sharing it with you. And I hope this gave you some insights about the fact that Jesus did have significance. His death was massively significant, not only for the Christians and not only based on their interpretation, but also based on the prevailing Jewish interpretation of the time. I think there's enough evidence here to say that Jesus' death was significant not only to the Christians, but also to the Jews. And I think that leads us in some interesting directions if we follow that towards its natural conclusion, or if we even try to weigh it with some more objective statistical analysis. Hi, everybody. I've already recorded the video and I recorded all the audio, but I did want to add this summary at the end because I think I wanted to crystallize 2 important points that came from all my historical research around this particular event. The first important point is that there's evidence that the tearing of the veil actually happened, okay? And that includes the evidence from the Christians, the evidence from the Jews, and some of the testimony of Josephus. But if you group that evidence together with the larger body of evidence that includes the failure of the barriers around the Holy Holies, so we're also including all the documentation that we have that the doors of the temple were opening spontaneously. So if you kind of include that as a conclusion, then I think the evidence is not only strong, but almost irrefutable from the perspective of historical scholarship. So I think that's one important point that I wanted to make. The second important point is, again, as an atheist, I would have expected that the death of Jesus would not have been ascribed with any special significance from the Jews. So the fact that both the Christians and the Jews interpreted Jesus' death as theologically significant, I think that makes a very interesting point that, to me, I found difficult to refute from my atheist perspective. So those are the two conclusions that I really wanted to underscore. We're a new channel, so I really hope that you like this video. Please click the like button. If you're interested, please click the notification bell to get notified of future videos. Please feel free to subscribe to the channel. As a new channel, that's massively helpful to us. Please weigh in on the comment section. I would love to know if this video moved the needle for any of you. To me, this was a really fascinating journey. I learned a lot from this. I would like to know if this changes your perspective on Jesus or first century Judea. If you're an atheist, does this change what you believe? If you're Christian, does it make you feel any differently about some of these historical events? I would love to know the answer to those questions. And also get at me and let me know if you have suggestions for future videos. Well, this has been really fun. Thanks everyone for being so kind and so supportive throughout my journey. And please, as always, have a really wonderful day.